Welcome to this event that has been curated by the BFI Film Academy young programmer Billy Collins. Welcome to Queer and Pleasant Land. I just want to introduce our panelists tonight. Rupert Williams, producer of Landline, an award-winning short documentary about gay farmers' helplines. Emma Plover, a visual artist who produced Rewilding, a short video essay about being queer in a rural environment. And Michelle Laverick, chair of Worksworth and District LGBTQI+ group. Michelle organises queer film nights at the Northern Light Cinema in rural Derbyshire. So to kick things off, I just want to ask, what is it like being LGBTQIA+ in a rural setting, in a rural community? Rupert, you go first.
I'm cheating because I left. He says, in his North London home. I don't know, because I think there's just different levels to that kind of rural community and those rural spaces and kind of what that means. So it's I had quite a unique experience, growing up in a farming family, Mm-hmm. So for me, it was I just always knew I was going to leave, It was an option to stay, but I don't think I could have stayed in the being who I was, that just doesn't necessarily just relate to sexuality. So I think for me, it was quite difficult. It was quite tricky. I didn't kind of realize it was an option, and I don't know, I sort of didn't see my story told. So it's quite difficult. And I thought it was also difficult being a man who was a farmer as well, because I didn't see there's an emotional vocabulary for a lot of men. And so you tie that over. I mean, I suppose I'm bisexual, so in some ways there's when I'm with women, and it's a very different situation to how I'm with men when I'm in rural spaces, in terms of dating and relationships and stuff. Yeah, so I kind of thought it would be easier in a city, and I think that was probably an assumption, but an assumption that I don't think was too far off. But also I think maybe there's a different sort of community that exists in kind of rural spaces that's kind of queer or LGBT. It's there, it's kind of present. And I don't know, just something. So as I say, I'll try and wrap up soon. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but when I made Landline, I found the reason I think I made was involved in making Landline, or had this gem of the idea, was because I sort of needed to, you move from those spaces, but I really held on to that farming family, that farming identity in some way, it's quite a strong culture. And I ended up speaking to someone who's 80 years old in rural Cumbria, who worked on Cumbria's gay phone line in the 1960s and 70s. He was a farmer, but that person was in the village next door to they were from the village next door to where my mum was from. So it's yeah, I don't know, made me, I didn't realize, I would have loved to have known that when I was younger, that gay people existed, and couldn't say gay, queer, existed, So yeah, for me it was tricky. I don't know. But
I was going to say, just on what you said there, is that it can also work in the opposite direction, which is I'm a town rat who ended up living in the country. Mm-hmm. And I came out in a rural location as opposed to being in a metropolitan area. Admittedly, it's decades later. I only came out 3 or 4 years ago. I wonder whether what it's really about is, can you come out in the place that you were born, whether that's in a large town or a city or a rural location where everybody knows you and has maybe preconceived ideas of who you are. So when you come out, what that does is sort of send psychic ripples across all those local connections. Whereas if you come to a place where you don't have that, like my family don't live here, it's like a blank canvas where you get to define who you are based on the fact that here I am in this new place, a relatively new person to wherever it happens to be where you're living.
And what about you, Emma?
That was quite interesting what you said about psychic ripples and people sort of not knowing you or having any preconceived ideas, because I gave being in a city a go as well, and I actually went to London first, and I didn't get on with it at all. And and then I came back home and then went to Manchester to go to uni, and I had a great time in Manchester. Like I kind of came out before I went to London or Manchester, but then I actually moved back after I graduated, because I was just sort of in that situation where I didn't think I could work enough in Manchester to live and do art. And I came home, and it was a really big decision, because like I had this huge history of, like, not huge history, but like my whole sort of like past history of like being in this place, and I had to come home and like find myself in this space, and like find what this space meant to me.
There's two narratives here, isn't there? I remember back in the 80s when the Communard Small Town Boy came out.
Yeah.
It was such that dominant narrative that if you wanted to be who you wanted to be, you had to leave your small town and you had to go to the city. And then there's that other popular narrative of being the only gay in the village from Little Britain. And that's funny, because some people do choose to make it the complete focus of their whole identity, their sexuality or their gender ID, or for some people it's just an aspect of who they are amongst all the other things that you do. But there's those two very popular cultural references about having to leave, or having to be the standard bearer of being the only gay in the village, and all that kind of stuff, which is obviously a bit tongue-in-cheek, but also there's like a lot of cliches. There's probably an element of truth to it. It wouldn't be a cliche if there wasn't.
It can feel very, very like real sometimes to be like the only guy in the village. I'm pretty sure I'm not, but like it does feel like it sometimes.
I've got a good example of that, an anecdote. About 2 years ago, I put together a float for our local carnival, and it was the first Pride float that they ever had. And of course, my complete fear was that no one would show up on the day and it would just be me on the float. Unfortunately, lots of people did turn up, so I didn't feel completely like the only person in the village. But I think whenever you do anything like that, where you're organising it and you're relying on other people to show up, part of you is like, oh, I hope other people will be there and it won't be just me on my own. But I think you could probably have that experience in a town or in a city or in a small village, that if you're sticking your neck out and being more visible, what if it is just you that's there and no one steps up to be alongside you, you know? Will they throw rotten apples at you and stuff like that?
Is that something about that, kind of what you both said about like that idea of like moving away? And like it takes the idea of like moving away, and often I think like some of the things that go with rural spaces, like the idea of like anonymity and like not being seen, and probably why I came to London and kind of like why I stayed in London. I remember kind of when I made it from you meet these farmers and thinking, oh, maybe I could marry a farmer, and like, you know, then it'd be all brilliant. But then so it's like a lot of the farmers that we met, we were really like we're white, all white men, you know. So it's kind of it's strange when you're like going to these like farming homes, but like of like some same-sex couples and things like that, and it's like weird how these guys remind me of my dad, like these quite like stoic northern farmers, you know. And I'm like, oh, but then I'd still have to be a farmer, and I don't really like farming.
I guess it's also something about diversity in all senses of the word. Before I lived here, I lived in Bristol and I lived in Birmingham. And if you know those cities well, they are very, very diverse, ethnically, religiously, in every possible manner. So it is a bit strange if you come to a part of rural Britain which is predominantly white British. It's sort of like, that was a bit odd. And I must admit, before I'd lived here for a few years, and when I got to the point of getting a job and thinking, right, I'd like to buy a house, I had a moment of, do I stay here or do I need to go back to the city? But I love Wirksworth and this town so much, and the people are so warm, so welcoming, so friendly. I can't imagine not having, if I hadn't have been here, I probably wouldn't have come out. which is kind of a weird topsy-turvy side of things.
Yeah.
Where most people feel they have to leave a small rural location to be themselves. For me, it was the other way around. And there's something about a smaller community where you know everybody, that if, as long as it's not a toxic environment or anything like that, can actually be very reassuring. You know, where you walk down the street and everybody knows your name. It's not like Return to the 1950s, but it is kind of. I feel like there is a real community here, whereas the city gives you freedom through anonymity. Nobody knows you, and no one really cares. As long as you don't get in the way of their lives, you can do whatever you want. So there's freedom there, but by being anonymous.
It's almost like a false dichotomy of acceptance I find in the city sometimes. I think you can almost like find your tribe maybe more easily in a city based on numbers, maybe. But like I don't know. I think sometimes there's acceptance in the countryside and rural spaces in different ways. I think I don't know. It's I think those prejudices exist in some ways exist in a way that's kind of very precarious, But I also know like the way that my family or farmers would accept people. They might accept people in like a sort of different way. And it's this kind of the idea of like, you don't talk about sex, you don't talk about sexuality, you don't talk about your business too much. The idea of you accept people on the individual, but maybe not the group as much. So but I think when you're accepted, I wonder is it more genuine acceptance? I mean, I don't know, because I'm like, I don't know. I'm not always too sure, but like it's not straightforward, but I don't think it's as linear as necessarily not fitting in and being excluded. Like I know a lot of people will not go to the countryside for understandable reasons, but it's.
I think the other thing I would say about it is, I think, given just the sheer numbers of people in a city, millions of people, it's not just that you can create a bubble of acceptance. That bubble can be age limited as well. So you can surround yourself by lots of people of your own age. Whereas, obviously, in a smaller town or a smaller village, your allies and the people that you're going to be part of your social bubble will be across a huge age range, simply because of the numbers. So there are members and friends of the Worksworth LGBT group who are in their early 20s, and there are people who are in their late 70s. So there's diversity, maybe not on an ethnic basis, but a diversity through age range, where people who are of different generations mix. And that, I'm thinking of two of my friends here, two guys who are, I don't know how to say how old they are, they might be offended. I think in their late 60s, early 70s, I'm being very generous now. But they tell me stories of what life was like for them growing up in the 50s and the 60s, which would make your jaws drop, about the conditions that they grew up in, which, you hear about that maybe in documentaries or on film, but it's quite another to hear it directly from somebody who's had that as their lived experience.
So I guess off the back of what you've just discussed, I would ask if there's any specific challenges that you think young LGBTQI plus people face in rural settings and in rural communities.
So one of the things a friend of mine locally said, just in passing, was how many people in the town where I live, and it's not just this town, it's other towns, didn't come out until after they left school. That somehow, if you were questioning your sexuality or your gender identity, or if you were identifying as queer or non-binary or whatever you were identifying with, that is something that you can't do before you've left school. And I found that a little bit sad. And I guess the reason why people kind of keep a lid on their identity until that point is for fear of being bullied at school. But when I thought about that, I thought, well, that could happen in a rural location. It could happen in a city, because schools can be quite a brutal, unforgiving place for people who are different, for want of a better word. But I don't know, is that a silly idea for me to have?
I think it's valid. I think it's completely valid. Emma, do Do you think film and TV played a role in the preconceptions you've had of LGBTQ personalities because of growing up in a rural setting?
I think so. I think I had a huge like idea that you had to be born this way, and like only certain people who knew from a certain age that they were LGBTQI plus, that like you had to know from like when you were a kid, and that I didn't know that I was from a kid. So like I came out when I was 19. I didn't even realize that I could be gay. Like I didn't know that you could get young people that I thought were cute that were my age, or like sort of around my age. And for like ages, I just was like, okay, this is obviously just what it is. Like you have crushes on girls and then you just date a boy, and that's just what it is.
Do you think that you're watching LGBTQI plus movies and films and TV shows? Do you think that fed into what you thought about the LGBTQ plus community as a whole, because you weren't exactly best placed to experience it as a community? I mean, that's an assumption. I don't know, because I grew up in big old Birmingham, which is no.
Yeah, I mean, the first time that I sort of, well, I don't even know. Like, I don't think I saw any films or movies that had LGBT characters on, like when I was younger. Or if I did, they were definitely like predatory butch lesbian stereotypes. And like for a long time I was really like sort of like I didn't want to be seen as like a predatory lesbian. And like and also like the sort of idea that you have to look a certain way and like be a certain type of person to be queer or to be a lesbian. And like for me, it turns out that I like having short hair, and I also like wearing dresses, and like that's something that like a lot of movies and stuff don't really like have those two intersections of like identity. It's either like very strict stereotypes, which do exist, and like not stereotypes, but like people dress a certain way, and I like that's completely cool. But like I didn't know for ages that that's what I could do as well. And like I think for me, the complete lack of having any kind of like stuff to watch with like relatable characters in was like, it was definitely first of all, it was the most thing that motivated me to sort of like record my own experience, because I was like, I don't see this anywhere else. Like I need to sort of like start making it myself. And also it fed into the idea that you had to be in a city, you had to like go to London, and like obviously because I sort of was interested in art as well, like the idea that you have to be in London to do art, like those two things were very like connected. And I thought that if I went to London and did art in London and was gay in London, that I could like be myself, and it turns out that that doesn't always work. And like I shaved my hair when I was in London, and like that was like 6 or 7 years ago, and like I probably wouldn't grow it back, but like I think London, like you said, Rupert, gave me sort of like the anonymity to like be myself without like the sort of being seen by everybody. Because like when you live in like I don't live in a super rural town, like a super rural village. Like I live in quite a big village on the outskirts of a main town, and it still feels like everybody is watching you. And like it's kind of nice because like since coming back from Manchester, I've actually made friends like in a really weird way by just walking my dog up the road. That like I've literally made friends with like all the old people on the road, and like they're all like, I don't know, they love my dog, but they also like are really friendly, and like I just love talking to everybody. And it's really nice because it's like I had this like perception that like people here were like really judgy, and like people I think can be judgy sometimes, but like not everybody. And I think that has been like a really wholesome thing for me to like make friends with all the old people, because especially because like there is quite a lot of old people here, and like I imagine I'm probably one of like maybe the only queer people that they know, or like that they are aware of, that they know. And whether they know I'm queer or not, I don't know, they might just think I've just got short hair, but you never know. But like you never know.
I think you said something really important about how you felt growing up, you didn't feel represented on screen.
Yeah.
And there's a weird sort of thing that's going on there where if you don't see yourself on screen, do you even exist? Do you exist just as a thing inside your head and there's no one else in the world that's like you? Whereas as soon as you do see yourself on screen, that somehow validates you, not as a person, but the life you want to live and the person you are. But why do we feel that we have to be on screen to feel validated? Why doesn't that validation come from within? It just seems to be very important.
I just slightly see it in a slightly different way. I think like screen and not screen, it's like, I think every community tells stories, like looks at stories and has kind of, or has always like told stories. And I think if you're like from like a rural space or a space where there's maybe less where there either is less diversity or is perceived as less diverse, there's always like a set of rules that you're kind of meant to live by. So growing up in those ways, you kind of hold on to, for me, like you might hold on to those rules and the people around you hold on to those rules. So it's almost like, whilst it says, why do I feel the need to be like this? Who's saying this? No one might explicitly say it, but there's those like codes that are governed by that community. So I feel for me, it's like, in the absence of, I still remember the first time I saw like a gay farmer. It was an episode of Hollyoaks, and he was a farmer's son, and he was gay, and I still remember it, you know. But like in the absence of that, I probably looked at like I was kind of almost like obsessed by the idea of like what's racism look like in rural spaces. Or there's like a photographer called Ingrid Pollard. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Ingrid Pollard, but so Ingrid Pollard, she did a series of like photos of her as like a black woman in the countryside called Pastoral Interlude. So I was just kind of, I probably looked towards, maybe a voyeuristic thing, but I looked at these like communities that I found looking at quite traditional or these quite patriarchal communities, like for like how they were in the countryside, what that was like kind of for them, because I couldn't see anything in it. So for me, it was a bit like, I think there was probably something about what you're saying, Michelle, that I didn't need to hold on to these stories to find validation, but I probably think that I did find that, you know, and it made quite a difference just to know that I could exist, I think, you know.
I think that's a great segue to start looking at the story that you actually helped create, Rupert. So do you want to introduce Landline?
Landline is a short film about a gay farmers helpline. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I always just had this idea of wanting to make a documentary about kind of gay farmers, because the few farmers that I met who were gay over the years, I was just again intrigued about how they. I remember the first person I met. He was a guy who had his own like stables like outside of London. He came to this group, and I was just like sort of fascinated. Like, how did you stay? Why did you not leave? You should have left. Just like the intrigue about his life, you know. Like I didn't know it was an option almost. And then I just met a few, and I heard about this helpline that's set up for gay farmers. And I was working at the time on a London Lesbian Gay Switchboard as a volunteer. So I was just kind of probably came at it. So I just got in touch with this guy, Keith. He said he spoke to Keith Innocent, who's the chaplain who set up the helpline, a gay man himself. And I just became really interested in the story. And I began to talk about it with my friend Matt Houghton, who's the film director. And so, we kind of ended up interviewing a lot of these farmers. And originally we were just speaking to a lot of gay farmers, and most of them had spoken to Keith in some capacity. So we ended up deciding to focus on the helpline and the people that Keith spoke to. There's a few different, there's like, I think maybe 4 or 5 different callers who feature in the film. But I decided to go with Emlyn because I thought that was maybe a bit more of a nuanced story, you know. Some were more uplifting, some less so, some talk about suicide, but his what I thought was a bit more nuanced, you know. So that's why I decided to feature Emlyn's clip. So Emlyn was one of those people that we spoke to who kind of, I don't know, sort of found this way to navigate his sexuality, you know. So it's so that's why I thought this clip was maybe more representative than some of the others, you know. If that answers
Perfect.
your questions, all right?
It does, yeah. And we're going to play Landline now for everyone.
I grew up in a small rural village in West Wales. There are hidden rules and regulations. You know, this kind of behaviour is tolerated, and this kind of behaviour isn't. There's no such thing as a gay farmer, but I feel as if there's something in me, there's that vein of rural life which will never disappear. This sounds really weird, but I was doing Tai Chi for a long number of years. My doctor told me I'd have to live with sciatica for the rest of my life, and I thought, bugger you, I'm not going to. I met this gentleman who was also going to the Tai Chi. We'd see each other, we used to smile and, you know, and he used to stay way after the time, and I used to have to remind him sometimes, oh, you better go home to your wife and kids now. I still remember him now, and to be perfectly honest with you, I have thought about him often. You do remember your first love?
So, Rupert, you've already discussed the genesis of your project. Emma, do you want to talk to us about how your project began?
So I moved back from Manchester to where I live now, which is with my parents actually. And I sort of was looking at the way that I could come home to myself, sort of in a rural space, and what that meant, because I had no sort of form of validation in that way. That like my queer friends were in Manchester still, like my partner lived in South Wales at the time, and like it was kind of weird because I was like sort of in this space where I had all this like this history, and like how can I in a way like work out where my space was in that space, and like I kind of embraced the idea that I was like a rural outsider, and kind of like instead of immediately trying to find myself within the community, I actually tried to find myself within the land and what that meant to me, like within like nature, within like the soil, and like from the soil grow back up again into like part of the community as someone who felt more rooted rather than someone who just sort of like blew in like a leaf.
You did that through rural media. Can you tell us a little bit about that that relationship between you and rural media, and what is rural media for those of our viewers that don't know?
So rural media is a production company, and also I think they're part charity based in Hereford, and I applied for like the job of rural artist, because like not rural artist, digital artist. As I saw this job for like digital artist, I was like, that's a job title, and I applied, and like they didn't say I wasn't able to get the job because I didn't have enough experience, but they were like, we really loved you during the interview. Do you want to have like a junior version of that, like of that job? And they were also like, we really liked what you were saying about sort of being queer in the countryside, because like I kind of didn't want to come home and go back in the closet. I didn't want to pretend to not be who I was, because all my art that I'd made whilst I was in Manchester was about being queer and like my experience of that. And I was like, I'm not going to go back into the closet. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. I want to talk openly about being queer in the countryside. And they were like, we want you to make queer work. And I was like, what does this mean? Like I didn't expect that to happen, and I was really, really surprised. But then, like, it actually they really support young artists, young filmmakers, like, well, not even just filmmakers, young people in general, and they want to sort of like get young people's voices out. They also like really support the traveling community, which I think is really like, it shows that it's not just like a superficial like we want to support like this one queer filmmaker. Like they're really like, through what they do, it really shows that they want to support voices that aren't heard very often. And I thought that was really like cool that existed in like a rural county. And like I was really having quite a difficult time with, like, I had really severe knee pain, and like I couldn't come in very often because it was like a 3-hour journey for me to get from door to door, and it was I was sort of having sort of a bit of a weird mental health time as well. Like things were quite like, because it was winter, it was quite slow, and like it was quite challenging, but in like a way that they really, really supported me. And like I really was like so grateful of that experience, because like it was such a nurturing way to come back to the countryside, and like especially being encouraged to make queer artwork, queer video, like that wasn't something that I'd ever expected, and like it was really, really lovely.
And that's the thing. I mean, like, none of you come from a film background. What was it about film that really drew you in?
For me in general, well, for me personally, it was about not seeing myself. And I was like, when I was at uni, I did my dissertation. It wasn't a dissertation, it was a critical analysis, but like my third year essay, I did it about personal experience in academic writing. And whilst doing all the research for that, like there was like barely any information, and like barely, like there was quite a lot of people, there was like a couple of people in the 90s who were like doing a lot of research into like space and sexuality, and there was actually a geographer, I think he's a geographer, John Binney at Manchester Met, who still does quite a lot. And it was really interesting because like I was like looking at this one person's piece of writing who was in Sweden, and it was their master's thesis, I think it was, and they spoke about their experience in a queer area. And because I didn't see myself, I was like, why am I not making what I want to see? And like and with obviously like social media and like being able to share your like experience like really, really quickly and really easily, like if you've made like a network of people, and also if you haven't got a network of people, like sharing your experience online can like draw people in, or like even connect with people that you didn't know would be interested in that, and like sharing your experience. And then sort of, I don't know, like I've had people come back to me and be like, I knew you when we were at school, and like actually seeing you do this has been like really interesting because it's made me think about myself. And I think through video you share, well for me anyway, I share exactly what I've seen, and like I think to share my viewpoint is like a really valuable thing, because like my viewpoint hasn't been shared in, like obviously not just my viewpoint, but like people like me, our viewpoints haven't been shared that often or heard or seen. And I think that's really important to like, even though obviously everybody's experiences are important, but like to see viewpoints and like experiences that aren't often heard.
Michelle, what do you think about Emma's perspective on their experience and drawing from film? What drew you to film in comparison? Sorry.
Yeah, I kind of feel like a bit of an interloper surrounded by all these creative, artistic types. Because I don't create anything. I'm not a filmmaker like some of these wonderful people. But I guess what happened is the story is that I am a huge fan of the Archers, and there's a group called the Academic Archers. Believe it or not, a bunch of academics get together to discuss the Archers and its significance to humanity. And last year, or maybe the year before, one of the sessions was about being queer in the Archers, being queer in a rural context, and it really started making me think about where I was physically, you know. So that session inspired me to come back and do two things. One was to do this carnival float, and then off the back of that, I realised I didn't want that event to be just once a year. And a group of people had sort of kind of coalesced around doing that. So in the town where I live in Wirksworth, Gem of the Peak, there's a wonderful kind of boutique, some people might say arts-based cinema, but it shows blockbusters just as well. And I noticed some of the other local groups, mainly the Twinning Society, had started to run films there, mainly as fundraisers to fund the Twinning Society. So I picked up on that and thought, well, why don't we do that? So for me, it was as much about putting on a season of films that would represent a narrative across the whole community, whatever you identify as, but also about bringing people together physically. Because at that stage, we had a Facebook group and we'd done the carnival, but I didn't want it to be just like an online thing. I wanted to try and bring people together, often from very different backgrounds, different classes, different ages and things like that. And so the cinema idea seemed a great way of bringing people together so they could actually meet and make real in-person connections with each other, but also have an entertaining evening out. And the other thing I was thinking of at the time was, you know, when you meet a bunch of 50 people you don't know, what are you going to talk about? So I thought, in a way, the film would be a focal point, especially when the film had come to an end, because I guess it's a bit like going on a date. You can talk about the film. What did you think of the characters? What did you think of the story? Was that unrealistic, realistic? Does it matter if it's realistic or not? And so I definitely didn't want a situation where when the film was over, people just went, bye. So the great thing about Northern Lights is it does have like its own little bar area and social area, which I sort of dressed up in rainbow flags and the whole lot. So it became like a whole evening of which the film was the focal point. Of course, you can't ignore the fact that we're in this middle of this COVID thing. So sadly, a lot of that work has just come to a halt because the cinema had to close its doors. At the moment, the cinema's doing a couple of outdoor events while the weather is okay. So they showed A Life of Brian last week. This week they're showing Moulin Rouge in an outdoor setting with social distancing in place. And my hope is that with a little bit of funding, I think from the BFI, it might have been some from other source, the cinema will have enough financial resources to reignite the season of films and be able to offset the fact that, you know, they can't fill all the seats because of social distancing and still be economically viable. But that's how it sort of got started.
That's really interesting. We'll move more on to about watching a film in a rural setting in a bit. But Emma, do you want to introduce Rewilding for us?
So this is my film Rewilding. It's a video installation exploring queerness, identity, rurality, and digital connection. It draws our attention to the overlooked experiences of the familiar surroundings, the magic contained in our everyday lives, and the nature we're a part of.
If a queer falls in the woods, and there is no one there to see them, did they even exist at all? If I live a queer life in the countryside, and no one acknowledges me, did I even live at all? To be seen is to be acknowledged. To be acknowledged is to be recognised. To be recognised is to be seen. To be seen is to be human. The need to be seen has required me to search out of this realm, into another dimension, into digital space. The need to be seen is not out of vanity. It is the need for validation. To have someone else confirm to me that I have lived and that I am real. It is vital. After all, even so, through the edge of the trees I see myself. I am seen. I am real. As are you.
Can I ask how both your films, Emma and Rupert, how they were received?
I think it was kind of received quite well, but I still felt like it was an audience that will go see short films in the city, you know. And so yeah, I think it was received well, but I also I kind of really wanted it to be in a rural space, like to be shown in a rural space, to be shown in a rural community. Like my dream was for it to be shown at like young farmers groups, like all like people who are from the communities that it was made by. Like, so I think so it's like, so Michelle's event that she's running, that's like perfect, but also a lot of farmers don't go to the cinema, you know. Like someone made a really good comment that farmers will go to the cinema, and this is quite gendered and assumption of who is a farmer in itself. Farmers will go to the cinemas when their wives drag them to the cinemas. So it was kind of well received, and we got some press in like the Farmers Weekly, which is like the magazine that my dad grew up reading. So I was really pleased that it got into those spaces. But I felt like it was received. I feel it might have been received by more of an urban film-going audience, and I wanted to be in a different space.
Emma, do you feel similarly?
My film hasn't really gone anywhere. So I finished it it was supposed to be showcased just the week that we went into lockdown. So it hasn't actually been showcased in that way. I've sent it to quite a few people that I feel might have resonated with it, and from them I've because obviously the last line is about seeing yourself, and I think that that is for the people that need to have that said to them, that it's about you seeing yourself, and regardless of who goes to see that, I think whoever sees it as well, even if it's online, if it's someone's phone, whatever, they might not think anything of it, but they also might just reflect on how they treat other people in the world, or how they treat themselves, or what it might mean to be that person who feels very alone and feels very like they're the only person that exists. And then, or to people that are queer in the countryside, to see yourself as an act of acknowledging that you exist, and to acknowledge that you're real and that you're a person, that can literally save your life. And even if it means for me to say I see you, I want to be that sort of start of someone seeing themselves, because it's all well and good other people seeing you, but if you don't see yourself, that's the real stuff there.
Michelle, what are the main things you take into consideration when programming for a rural audience?
One of the first things that I was very keen to do was, for every letter of the rainbow, there should be a film that resonates. So I have put into the programme a film about a relationship between two young men in France. It was a French film, forget the title. And then we showed Rafiki, which is the story of two young women set in Africa. I forget which country it was now. And then the third film was a film that Pedro Almodovar sponsored, A Fantastic Woman, which came out a few years ago. So for me, it's important when we come to put films on that I'm, making sure that everybody feels that there will be a film where they feel represented. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Weirdly, it's been a lot of foreign language films that we've done, which wasn't particularly planned. But I mean, one of the things I'm thinking just about the conversation we're having today is I need your films on. We've got to show your films alongside our main feature, whatever that might be. There is a place, as was being said a moment ago, a film about a rural location, presented in a rural location. I mean, we're not in deepest, darkest Peak District here. It's a small market town, so I don't want to overstate how rural we are. But I think what's nice about having a kind of community cinema, or a cinema that is very local to you, is if you think back to when my parents were growing up, there used to be 3 or 4 or 5, 6 cinemas in a single town, before television really took off. And there was actually a cinema in this town back in the day, but it closed in, I don't know when, the 70s or 80s. And it was Paul and Esther Carr, who were two local people here who built Northern Light Cinema from scratch from what used to be an old hardware shop with a warehouse at the back. That warehouse became the cinema. And without them, there wouldn't have been the space for me to put these films on. So, you know, it's about, I think you have to sort of create the venue. So there is another cinema not far away from here in a town called Belper. And there's another settlement near where I live called Middleton. And they have a community cinema that runs, I think, once every 2 weeks or once a month before COVID hit. So I think in a way, if we want more films about rural locations being made and more films about rural locations being played in rural locations, you've got to have the venues to do that. So without the cinema here, people would have to venture to the outskirts of Chesterfield or Derbyshire or even into Nottingham to where Broadway cinema is. So it's about accessibility as much as, you know, there's no point in putting in a season of films if people have to drive an hour and off to get to see the film.
I completely agree. So just one more question. What piece of advice would you give to potential filmmakers living rurally in one sentence?
I'd say don't be afraid to share your experience.
I would say try to step outside your experience to know what it is. That makes sure your experience can connect with other people at the same time as telling it in an authentic way.
Okay, cool. Michelle, as a programmer, what advice would you give to filmmakers, young filmmakers living rurally?
Wow, God, my advice. I don't know. It's really hard to answer that and feel I can authentically give somebody advice about what films they should make when I've never made one myself. But I guess one thing that came out of thoughts that I always have is about whatever the narrative is, it's got to come naturally out of the experience rather than it being sort of shoehorned into a situation. I find it really difficult to describe what I mean by that.
Yeah, I think like authentic storytelling.
Yeah, I guess it comes from me talking about the Archers thing. There's always this tension in, I think, in some forms that do you merely reflect reality as you see it, or do you create a film which is a vision of what you would like the world to be? And there are some people who want a kind of simulacrum of reality that, you know, it can't be in an imagination of what the world could be like. So I guess there must be space for both, a kind of like the world as which I see it and the world as which I'd like it to be. And I guess anybody who can manage to bring those two things together have got the license to print money. But if I knew how that was done, I'd be doing it, I think.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for answering that question. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for a huge thank you to all our guests. Thank you for coming. Thank you for talking so openly about your own experiences. That was actually really enlightening for me as someone that's always been in a city environment to understand queerness outside of the city. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for watching this event. Please look out for more events curated by BFI Film Academy young programmers during the BFI London Film Festival.